almost 2:30 here or so. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it off for Janine. My name's Guy Camomilli, and I work in the same office with her, but she couldn't be here today, so I'm filling in. In a moment, I'll introduce Dr. Weir. He'll be presenting on the role that physical fitness plays in reducing the risk of metabolic syndrome. Just a few real quick announcements. First, this VITS is being recorded. If you're not able to attend the VITS and you're calling in today on the WebEx, be sure to mute your phones. If you have a phone that doesn't have a mute button, *6 will also mute your phone. That's *6. So, as I mentioned, Dr.
We're
Weir...
not hearing anybody. How come?
Okay, we can hear you okay, though. So, most of us know Dr. Weir. He's going to talk with us today on metabolic syndrome and the role of physical fitness. Dr. Weir, really looking forward to your presentation. And so with that, I'll turn it over to you.
I'll get your WebEx up here.
Dr. Weir, if you keyed your mic.
Sorry, guy. You hear me now? There you go. Thanks for the introduction. I was told I need to get this done within 1 hour, so I'm going to have to sort of fly through these slides and charts, but hopefully I'll leave some time for questions at the end. This presentation is designed to explain what metabolic syndrome is, what are the diseases and disorders associated with it, how prevalent it is in North America, how physical activity and fitness play a role in metabolic syndrome, and how we can treat it, prevent it. And then I'll say in the summary, in a real short sentence, what took me an hour to say before that. All right, now, what is metabolic syndrome? People get a little bit confused when they hear that term metabolic syndrome because they may not even quite understand what metabolism is. But a simplified definition from the Webster's dictionary is that the metabolism very basically refers to the biochemical processes involved in all the body's normal functioning. That includes the transfer of energy from stored energy to movement energy and handling all the byproducts of energy. A syndrome is not a disease in and of itself. Rather, it's a group of signs and symptoms that occur together and characterize a particular abnormality. And notice it's an abnormality, so it suggests the probability that a disease will occur, but it isn't by itself defined as a disease. The American Heart Association defines the metabolic syndrome as, quote, a risk of risk factors that occur together and increase the risk for coronary heart disease, stroke, peripheral vascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and other disorders. It's also been called Syndrome X and the insulin resistance syndrome, and a number of organizations have sort of argued over the definition of what the metabolic syndrome is because some focus more strongly on diabetes and insulin resistance, but all of them agree to this general definition that's been released by the American Heart Association. The National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute has released a nice list showing the common components of metabolic syndrome and its causes. It's not really known if there's any one real certain cause all by itself, but the U.S. National Library of Medicine released this statement in 2011, saying that researchers are not sure whether the syndrome is due to one single cause, but all of the risks of the syndrome are related to obesity. So the lead factor in metabolic syndrome is obesity, especially obesity around the belly. And I'm going to say a lot more about that in a few minutes. All of the rest of the factors are associated by being overweight, especially if you have a large belly. Now, the American Diabetic Association and other associations that are concerned with diabetes care want to make sure we all understand that the syndrome also comes with insulin resistance. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are diabetic. It means that when the pancreas produces the insulin and it carries the glucose to the cells for energy, that the cells resist the uptake of the glucose. It doesn't necessarily not accept them at all. That there's not necessarily intolerant to the glucose, but it tends to resist it. And since it resists it, then we tend to have a greater buildup of glucose in the bloodstream and in the urine, and so it's identified by having more than normal glucose in the blood. It's also associated with inactive lifestyle, and that's really the focus of my presentation today. There's an age role. It's not as strong as some of the others, but it's no question the older we are, the greater the risk for metabolic syndrome. I won't say a lot about genetics because we can't do anything about it, like we can't do anything about aging. But we should be aware that genetics play a role, so that if your mother or father have had cardiovascular disease, diabetes, or metabolic syndrome, you're more likely to be susceptible to it than if that were not the case. Atherogenic dyslipidemia is a fancy word by saying you have too much fat in your blood. And it's identified by blood chemistry exams that measure cholesterol and the constituents of cholesterol, like LDL cholesterol and triglyceride. And the syndrome can cause a lot of stress on the kidneys, which respond to cause an elevation in blood pressure. It doesn't necessarily meet the classic definition of hypertension, but it does mean that your blood pressure is higher than it ordinarily would be. The pro-inflammatory state means that your blood vessels are under a constant state of inflammation, low-grade inflammation, and it's tested by the C-reactive protein test, CRP. Ordinarily, if we're well and healthy, that we have a CRP measurement of about 1 milligram per deciliter. When we have for certain infection, like a bacterial infection within fever and so forth, then the CRP can be 100. It can be quite high. But with low grade, like pro-inflammatory state, it's defined by a CRP of 1 to 10. So it's certainly above the normal, but it's not yet a raging infection. The prothrombotic state means you basically have thickened blood with fibrous tissue in it that looks like fibers under a microscope, and it can increase the capacity for clotting of the blood. Now, this is the way it's measured. Now, some organizations want to add some additional measurements, some other ways to measure this, such as some glucose tolerance testing and so on. But the National Cholesterol Education Program's Adult Treatment Panel 3 reported in 2004 give us this list that's the one that's most commonly used to define metabolic syndrome. The definition is to have 3 or more of any of these risks. These risks are all associated with cardiovascular disease and diabetes, but they're a little bit milder than the strict definition of the risks that are needed to define you at high risk for heart disease. But the number one there is having the big belly. That is a waist circumference of 40 inches or more for a man, 35 inches or more for a woman. Anything that or bigger puts you at risk for metabolic syndrome. Having triglycerides over 150 milligrams per deciliter. Having a low, that's a good form of cholesterol, low HDL cholesterol. Remember, HDL is a protective form, so you want it to be as large as possible. Below 40 for a man, below 50 for a woman. Having blood sugar or fasting blood glucose greater than 100 milligrams per deciliter. Normally we'll tell people not to have it over 110, but like I say, this is a little more moderate. You can have a lower level and be at risk for metabolic syndrome. 100 or more for blood glucose. And blood pressure, hypertension is normally defined as a 140 over 90 blood pressure, resting blood pressure. But for metabolic syndrome, if it's 130 over 85, either one, systolic of 130, diastolic of 85, either one of them, that puts you at risk. So if you've got 3 of any of these 5, that would define you as having metabolic syndrome. So, what difference does it make if you have metabolic syndrome? Well, if you take a look at some of these diseases, they should look familiar. These are the biggest killers in the modern world. And the diseases that are most closely associated with metabolic syndrome are heart disease, stroke, and type 2 diabetes. The others are there. The association is a little weaker, but it's definitely associated with cardiovascular disease, stroke, and diabetes. Some cancers, not all cancers, are also found to be associated with metabolic syndrome. Some very recent studies have shown Alzheimer's to be strongly associated with metabolic syndrome, kidney disease, and very recently some studies on asthma and chronic lower respiratory diseases of the lungs, such as asthma. If you add all those percentages up, you're going to come up with over 75% of all the deaths that happen every single day is associated with metabolic syndrome. So what? Well, here's a nice paper that was published in the 2004 edition of Circulation, a prominent journal on heart disease, where the author compared the risk of having none of the risks of metabolic syndrome, 0, as compared to having 1 or 2 risks, 3 risk, which is metabolic syndrome, remember it's 3 or more, or metabolic syndrome and diabetes. Now, if you have metabolic syndrome, that's that central column there, that's 3 risk. You have 3 times the probability of dying prematurely from any cause, especially cardiovascular disease, but any cause, as compared to none of the risks. Interestingly, if you only have 1 or 2 of those 5 risks that I mentioned, you have twice the risk of all-cause mortality or cardiovascular disease death than if you have none of the risk. The worst case is to have metabolic syndrome, that's 3 of the risk, plus being diabetic. And then the risk is 5 times greater than if you have none of the risk. And I hope you can see that happy-looking guy dancing around up there, because that's not only a guy who's physically active in my picture, that's an elderly fellow who is mentally active. Some very interesting studies have shown a very strong association between metabolic syndrome and cognitive function in elderly. And I just lost my mom, who went through a number of years of Alzheimer's. And the last few years of her life, she was very confused. She couldn't remember things. That's a typical characteristic of Alzheimer's. And she had not been very active in the last 5 or 6 years of her life. But they found that of all the risk, if you look at all the characteristics that try to define people with Alzheimer's, they can really not find any decent causes other than fitness. Physical fitness. They find people who are physically active are far less likely to have Alzheimer's and loss of memory and cognitive decline. Those with metabolic syndrome, if you compare elders with metabolic syndrome compared to those who don't have metabolic syndrome, remember this is 3 or more of those risks. Those with it have about 4.25 times higher risk of memory loss over a 12-year period. That was one of the studies. 3 times greater chance of having Alzheimer's disease. About 1.25 times greater chance of having some decline in cognition, especially immediate response to testing that require visual acuity. And also, it's about 66% higher risk for a 5-year cognitive decline if you have the metabolic syndrome plus an elevation in inflammation, the inflammation that I mentioned that's tested by the C-reactive protein. Whatever, there's no doubt that metabolic syndrome not only affects physical disease, such as heart disease, cancers, and so forth, it also is associated with cognitive function. How prevalent is metabolic syndrome? Well, according to the Adult Treatment Panel number 3, the report that was released in 2004, the obesity epidemic is the main cause for the rising prevalence of metabolic syndrome. Not only has the condition of obesity dramatically increased since 1980, so has metabolic syndrome. They tended to increase together. For example, in the early 90s, the prevalence of metabolic syndrome in the United States was about 21%. By the end of the 90s, it was up to around 27%. Now it's 34%. In the last 10 years, it's gone up 23% in 10 years. And of all the risk factors of metabolic syndrome, those 5 risk factors, the one that is most prominent for everybody who has metabolic syndrome is having a big belly. The abdominal obesity is the leader, way out ahead of the others. The others are there, there's no doubt about it. Hypertension, 40% of those who have metabolic syndrome are hypertensive, 39% with high blood sugar, 31% with high triglyceride, and 25% with low HDL. These risk factors do tend to vary with age, gender, and ethnicity, but they all go up with increasing body weight. The fatter you are, in other words, the higher the level of obesity, the higher the prevalence of any of these risks for metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is also closely associated with age. No doubt about it, people who are under 40 are far less likely to have metabolic syndrome than those that are over 40. For example, for the men and women in the large surveys that are conducted by the Centers for Disease Control, showed that those people who are under 40, men and women, have maybe about 9% of them have metabolic syndrome. But that jumps up to around 40% for the age group between 40 and 59, and over 50% for the men and women over 60. So the older you are, the greater the chance and the greater the prevalence of metabolic syndrome. And the fatter you are. The body mass index, by the way, for those who don't know what body mass index means, it's a ratio of your weight and your surface area. So it's your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared, which is surface area. And those who have a normal weight, that's a BMI less than 25, have a very low prevalence of metabolic syndrome, less than 10%. And the higher the body mass index, the higher the prevalence of metabolic syndrome, so that when you reach the level of obesity, which is BMI of 30 or more, you can see 50 to 65% of men and women with metabolic syndrome. The fatter you are, the older you are, the greater the prevalence. So what role does physical fitness play in metabolic syndrome? Been lots of literature on it. I've just summarized a few of the studies on the role of metabolic syndrome. By the way, I wrote a paper on metabolic syndrome, which I'll share with you in a few minutes, in the mid-'90s, and there were very few papers at that time on metabolic syndrome when I first wrote mine. Since then, there have been hundreds of papers. Now, the metabolic syndrome condition and the definition of metabolic syndrome is really not that new. It came out in the 1970s and 80s, but people just didn't use it very much until the obesity epidemic began to take over. But the research shows that metabolic syndrome is a factor not only in adults, but it's also a factor in kids. We're beginning to see lots of children who are overweight and physically inactive, and so if they are physically active and physically fit, it dramatically lowers the risk for metabolic syndrome in kids. It cuts the risk in general, and there are lots of different studies, but the average that I've found is it cuts the risk of metabolic syndrome by about 50% for adults. That is, being fit and active. Being physically fit will cut your risk by about 50% if you're an adult. It's especially effective for cutting metabolic syndrome risk for getting low-fit people active. You get somebody who's inactive and low-fit, and you get them to be active and fit, it dramatically reduces their risk for metabolic syndrome. And it's influenced not only by vigorous exercise, which is something many people in my field really promote. Get out there and run and do a lot of heavy sweat work. But we found that we get lots of reduction in risk by doing moderate or walking-related kinds of activities and reducing the risk, which is a nice thing to know. It isn't just influenced by aerobic exercise, but by strength training too. And for a really interesting study on men who had metabolic syndrome risk, they looked at the mortality risk. They had the metabolic syndrome risk, but they're also physically fit. That level of fitness attenuated their death risk because although they had the risk, they were protected by their fitness. Now here's a real interesting study on adults. Now I've got a 12-year-old and he spends half his life, it seems, playing video games and playing the kinds of games on TV, on computer and so forth. Drives me crazy. Along with all of his friends, when they get together, they don't want to go play hide and seek. They want to play video games. Drives me nuts. But this is a study on adults who do that. Adults who spend a lot of time playing video games, playing computer games, and watching TV. If you compare those adults who spend less than an hour a day on TV, video, or computer in combination, this is after work. I'm not talking about, I know we all have to work on computers at work. If you do an hour to 2 hours a day, 1 to 2 hours a day, you get about a 40% increase in having metabolic syndrome risk as compared to doing less than an hour a day. If you do 3 hours a day, the risk goes up to almost 70%. 4 hours a day, which is not uncommon at all when you combine TV and all the rest, add them all together, that's about double the risk of having metabolic syndrome as compared to none of those kinds of activities. So no doubt about it, sedentary lifestyle is a major factor, especially sedentary lifestyle when spent doing pursuits like this, raises the risk for metabolic syndrome. Now here's a study I mentioned that we reported on in 2006. We got data from about 1,700 NASA Johnson Space Center employees, all of whom had gone to our clinic, and we had some clinical data on them, so that we could identify the metabolic syndrome. So we had blood pressure data, we had glucose data, triglycerides, HDL cholesterol, and then they also went to the cardiopulmonary lab and were tested for cardiorespiratory fitness, body mass index, and percent fat. Here's some pictures of how we did that. We measured their level of physical activity using our NASA Physical Activity Status Scale. We call it the NASA PASS. I've reported on this instrument many times in my VITs, but in case you're not familiar with it, it's a 0 to 10 scale that asks you to rank your level of habitual activity over the previous month. In other words, the recent past. And a 0 to 1 is very low activity, like maybe the most you might do is low-level activity, walking from your car in the parking lot to your office. And then followed by 2 to 3 is recreational-related activity, like playing something like golf, bowling, or doing yard work for as much as an hour a week. And then more serious aerobic type of activity, running, jogging, walking briskly, playing basketball, and so forth. They go, the more you do, then the higher your rating. And we took a measure of percent fat by skin folds. We measured his waist girth right at the umbilicus. And that's, by the way, where it's always done to identify metabolic syndrome. You put the tape measure right above the belly button. Not down around where your pants hang, guys. It's right around the belly button. And the reason we use the navel, the umbilicus, is because everybody has one. For a long time, there were a lot of arguments about, well, where are you supposed to measure this? And so we figured, well, let's just standardize it, put it right above the belly button. We measured height and weight and calculated body mass index. And then we put them on a maximal treadmill stress test with oxygen collected. So notice the guy's got a hose in his mouth and a nose clip, and we ran him to all-out exertion and measured his maximum capacity for processing oxygen. And when we looked at just general prevalence, that first upper left chart shows that as these folks got older, there was a greater prevalence. So there's an association with age. And then the one right below it shows an inverse association with physical activity. So in other words, those that were more active, that had an activity rating of 6, had a much lower prevalence than those that were less active, those activity rating of less than 4. So the more active, the lower the prevalence for metabolic syndrome. The chart in the upper right shows body mass index, and so a body mass index less than 25 had a very low prevalence of metabolic syndrome, and as the body mass index rose, then there was a higher prevalence of metabolic syndrome. And then an inverse relationship with VO2 max. Those with a low VO2 max had the highest prevalence, and those with a high VO2 max had almost zero prevalence. So the higher the VO2 max, the lower the prevalence of metabolic syndrome. This one shows, and I told you earlier that one of the studies showed that if you have no risk of metabolic syndrome, you have very low risk of all-cause mortality. The higher the metabolic syndrome risk, the higher the all-cause and cardiovascular disease death risk. And that if you have one risk, you have much higher death risk than if you have none of the metabolic syndrome risk. And if you have metabolic syndrome, which is 3 or more risk, you have an even higher death risk. Well, these slides showed what was the effect on physical activity, body mass index, percent body fat, and VO2 max on the number of risks that we identified. So the one in the top left shows that those that had no risk, were the most active, had the highest activity rating, and those with 1 or 2 risk had a lower activity rating than those with no risk, but those with 1 or 2 risk had a significantly higher activity rating than those with metabolic syndrome. And all of those differences were statistically significant. Then the slide just below it on the body mass index shows that those with no risk had the lowest body mass index. Those with 1 or 2 risk had a significantly higher body mass index that was significantly higher than those with no risk, but significantly lower than those with 3 or more risks. The higher the risk, the higher the body mass index. And then the one on the right top is on VO2 max. And those that had no risk had the highest VO2 max. Those with 1 or 2 risk had a significantly lower VO2 max, but it was significantly higher than those with metabolic syndrome. And so that follows all of the patterns and trends of previous research. And by the way, I say previous research, this one was one of the first ones reported on that shows the role of fitness on body mass index. Now this slide shows how to calculate the probability for having metabolic syndrome. So we developed some methods for logistic regression to determine the probability of having metabolic syndrome dependent on your physical fitness. Now the red line is for a guy, this is for the men, who has a low VO2 max of 25, sorted by level of body mass index. Notice that if he's got a body mass index of 40 and a low VO2 max, meaning he's very low fit and he's very fat, low fit, high fat, his risk of metabolic syndrome is 90%. 90%. That means if you had a room of 100 men with these characteristics, low fit and high fat, 90 out of 100 would have 3 or more of those 5 risks. 90 out of 100 would have metabolic syndrome. At the opposite extreme, you see a guy who's very lean. He's got a body mass index of 20 and a high VO2 max of 45. His risk is almost 0. So being very fit and lean means it's very unlikely you're going to have at least 3 of those 5 risk factors that define metabolic syndrome. And we see the same trend for women, slightly less powerful, but it's definitely there. That is that the low-fat, high-fat woman has about an 83% probability of metabolic syndrome, and the low-fat, high-fit woman, that's the green triangle with VO2 max of 40 and a body mass index of 20, has almost a 0 probability. These are probabilities for metabolic syndrome. So another way to put it, here's an example. The probability for metabolic syndrome will go up with the low VO2 max and high body fat, and vice versa. For example, here's a 40-year-old woman. Her VO2 max is 20, so she's low fit. Her BMI is 40, so the probability is 80%. Or if her VO2 max is high, of 40, and her body mass index is 20, then the probability risk is only 1%. Very strong. By the way, these associations, were extremely accurate. It's very difficult to argue with the findings for these. Very, very accurate probabilities. Now, many people believe, and rightly so, that age plays a very strong association with metabolic syndrome and with everything you can name. So that red line there shows the effect of age on metabolic syndrome. This is for a guy 45 years old with VO2 max, which is a little above average of 35 milliliters per kg per minute. It's about average for a 45-year-old guy, maybe a little above, around average. He's fat, though. His body mass index is 30. If he doesn't change that, he keeps his level of fitness and his level of fatness the same, in 10 years, his risk goes from 28% to 33%. So there's definitely an age effect. But he did not change his VO2 max or his body mass index. What normally happens is that he does change it, and it's usually in a bad way. That is, he goes from his level of fitness goes down. This guy's VO2 max went down 5 points, and his body mass index went up 5 points. His VO2 max went from 45, from 35 down to 30, and his body mass index went from 30 up to 35. And the blue line shows now he went from a risk probability of 33% to about 75%, just because he got out of shape and he gained a lot of weight. And the reverse happens, and that is he became a good guy. He got active, he lost a lot of weight, he raised his VO2 max 5 points from 35 to 40, and he dropped his weight, body mass index from 30 to 25. Now his risk is below 10%, and he got just as old. He still gained age. But you see, age is a factor, but it's not near as strong as increasing his fitness and losing some fat. Now, how do you prevent metabolic syndrome? By the way, you prevent and treat it close to the same way. I'm going to talk about treatment in just a minute. If you, number one is don't smoke. That's a factor we tell everybody, and to prevent cardiovascular disease, cancers, and so forth. Same thing for metabolic syndrome. Don't smoke. Manage your blood pressure and your blood sugar. We recommend you manage your blood pressure and blood sugar, particularly through exercise and proper diet. If that doesn't do it, then you may have to go on drugs for those kinds of things. Keep the body mass index below 25. That's the cut. Don't get over 25. 25 is the definition. 25 or above is the definition of overweight. Make sure you exercise in accordance with the U.S. standards from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which were released. Those standards were released in 2008, and I'm going to define them, explain them to you in just a second. And have a healthy diet. So you have to make sure that diet and exercise are a good partner. The diet has to be appropriate for calories for the amount of exercise that you get. So you certainly can't overeat, or you're going to gain weight even though you're physically active. And also you want to make sure that your diet is fairly low in high glycemic carbohydrates, such as sugars. Low in fat, certainly below 30% of your total caloric intake. No more than 30%, probably around 25% of your total daily calories shouldn't be in fat. And then get a wide variety of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and fish twice a week, hopefully oily fish. This should not be news to anybody if you've been paying attention to any of Glenda's classes or dietitian's classes. This is just basic recommendations for good diet. Here's the activity recommendations from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. It was released in the year 2008, and they found that you get substantial improvement in health, including reduction in risk for metabolic syndrome by getting this amount of exercise. If you exercise moderately, that's, for example, walking or something of that level of intensity, you need to do at least 150 minutes a week. And so if you walk 5 days a week, that's 30 minutes 5 days a week. You walk 3 days a week, that's 50 minutes 50 minutes 3 days a week. If you jog, that's vigorous intensity, then you need to go 75 minutes. So if you do it 3 days a week, that's 25 minutes, or an equivalent combination of the two. In some of my previous lectures, I've really hammered hard on doing a whole lot of exercise because so much is needed for weight control. But we found that a little bit of exercise, especially at the moderate level, that first level, has done an awful lot for lowering at least one of the risk, and sometimes getting a person out of having 3 risks to less than 3. In other words, going from having metabolic syndrome to not being in metabolic syndrome. By increasing the exercise, you do get more benefit, no doubt about it. If you can double it to 300 minutes a week of moderate intensity, or 150 minutes of vigorous intensity, you get more benefit, and you certainly get more weight reduction, and that typically is what's necessary for weight reductions, higher level of physical activity. And we also recommend twice a week of some kind of resistance training. Now, how do you treat it? Notice treating it is pretty similar to preventing metabolic syndrome. The first line is to lose weight. And remember that the lead factor in metabolic syndrome is having a big belly, in other words, being overweight. There are some people with metabolic syndrome who are not grossly overweight. That's pretty rare, though. But they would still need to make lifestyle changes similar to these, even though they don't need to lose weight. And they should try to lose weight with increasing physical activity. Now, the weight reduction itself helps to lower the low-density lipoprotein cholesterol. The LDL cholesterol is a lead factor, the main culprit in atherosclerosis or cardiovascular disease. And also gradually increase the amount of physical activity. Don't do it too fast. Increase the amount of physical activity will help aid in weight loss. It improves the condition of the heart, the blood flow of the heart. It raises HDL cholesterol, a metabolic syndrome risk. It lowers blood sugar because the blood sugar is the principal method that our muscles get energy. And so if they're going to use the energy, it's going to gobble up some of that blood sugar, and that's a higher blood sugar is a metabolic syndrome risk. Triglycerides are also converted during exercise to free fatty acid and then quickly converted to glucose. And so triglyceride and glucose together, I'll call them the body's gasoline. And so if you exercise for long periods of time at moderate intensity, your triglycerides in the blood are going to go down. Some real interesting studies have shown if you put a guy on a treadmill, measure his triglyceride, leave him on the treadmill for walking for an hour, measure his triglyceride again, it's going to go down dramatically in that hour, just during that hour, not for a 3-month period, which is what's needed to lower cholesterol. But triglyceride goes down fast because it's used for energy. And then follow this, we call it the TLC, Tender Loving Care, or the Therapeutic Lifestyle Change Diet, which means that if your total fat intake, no more than 25% should be from fat, and no more than 7% from saturated fat, less than 200 milligrams a day from cholesterol. Now, an egg has a little bit more than 200 milligrams a day, so you can't have more than half an egg. So maybe an egg every 3 or 4 days, but not an egg every single day. No trans fatty acids, period. Have a high fiber diet. That's 10 to 25 grams a day of soluble fiber. Oatmeal is one of the best sources of soluble fiber. And 2 grams a day of plant sterols. Now, you may wonder, what is that? I said the same thing. But I was told by our dietitian you can find it at the grocery store in these little tubs. It looks sort of like margarine, these plant sterols and stanols, and add that to your toast instead of using margarine or butter. Make sure you don't have more than 10% of your total calories from sugar. That means you can't drink too much soda pop. And optionally, we found an improvement by adding some of the antioxidants such as vitamin C, vitamin E, and beta carotene. If you smoke, stop. I can't think of a simpler way to put it. You can't smoke. It's just, that's how it goes. And if these things don't help, most doctors will prescribe the therapeutic lifestyle change diet and physical exercise to help you lower your weight and lower the risk for months before they start putting you on the drugs. But if they don't stop, then you're going to have to listen to them. You may have to start getting on some statin drugs or something like that to improve your lipid profile. The amount of exercise is what's more important than the intensity. It's the amount, doing plenty of it. We found, for example, that doing exercise at moderate intensity, remember the difference, moderate intensity is like walking compared to running, lowers the risk of metabolic syndrome by about 50%. Doing it at vigorous intensity lowers it a little bit more, by 60%, but not a whole lot more. And so I do tell folks who aren't prepared yet to start running and doing something real hard, this is a case where doing a little bit really does help a lot. If you do a little bit, if you're overweight and you lose just 10 pounds, that tends to lower the blood pressure enough for many people to get them out of the metabolic syndrome risk. Just that simple change. And now you can reduce the metabolic syndrome risk by increasing your exercise, even if it doesn't raise VO2 max. Now, I've often encouraged people, you need to exercise vigorously every now and then to raise the VO2 max, and that's hard. And I've got a lot of frowns from people, in the audience and in these VITs and so forth, because I'm telling people to work so hard. And I am telling them to work hard, but we have found great benefit in doing some exercise, even if it doesn't raise VO2 max. It does help to lower the risk. And we've also found that the effect of exercise tends to be a whole lot better for people who are low fit than the people who are high fit. As a general rule, remember, people who are high fit are less likely to have metabolic syndrome to start with. And I think I got through this pretty fast. So here's my summary. Metabolic syndrome is a cluster of heart disease risk factors, all of which are associated with obesity. Obesity being the leader. Metabolic syndrome is associated with most of the world's most lethal diseases, most of them. Around 75 to 80% of all the deaths that occur every day are associated with metabolic syndrome. It's highly prevalent in the United States. Around 34% of the U.S. adults presently have metabolic syndrome, and that's up from around 20% in the early 90s. So it's really gone up along with the increase in the level of obesity. Activity and fitness play an important role in preventing and in treating metabolic syndrome. That's all my presentation. So do you have questions?
But it was really great, Larry. I'm going to have to start coming to these more, to be honest with you. I'm not being sarcastic at all. I've heard a lot of stuff presented by a lot of folks in different ways, but this really brings the science into it very well, so I appreciate that very much.
Thank you. Anybody else How about
Hi,
those?
Larry. This is Sarah Mark over at headquarters. Thank you for a fantastic presentation. It really was so comprehensive and kind of sobering. I think we all want to get out and go run and do something active today. I wanted to ask you about the issues surrounding sleep deprivation. We're seeing that may play a critical role towards increasing obesity and diabetes and certain cardiovascular diseases. What are your thoughts on that? How can we do something about that, and what should our messages be?
I will tell you that sleep deprivation is not my field. The guy here at NASA has been talking to me about trying to do a study on it, and there's no doubt about it. People who are deprived of sleep don't get enough rest, and if you don't get enough rest, there are all kinds of other problems, but that's not my field. I did see one paper where metabolic syndrome was associated with sleep apnea and sleep deprivation, but I wish I knew more about sleep deprivation. I just don't.
Okay, thank you.
You guys in this room got questions?
Can you review those factors that determine whether you have metabolic syndrome again? You mentioned the waist, triglycerides, low HDL, and I missed a couple.
Yeah. The question was, can we go over the risk factors for metabolic syndrome? And these are the ones that are accepted. There it is. Now, the people involved in diabetic care want to add two more. They want you to do a glucose tolerance test, and they also want to test for C-reactive protein for inflammation. But we have found that just these 5 risks, this is from the Adult Treatment Panel report of 2004, and the one that tends to be most used, that these 5 risks tend to do as well as any. The American Heart Association has pointed out that the classic risk factors they use in their Framingham panels, they say if you have high cholesterol and you're over a certain age and you smoke and have high blood pressure, those give you a pretty good indication of your risk for having cardiovascular disease or a cardiovascular event, like a heart attack. And they do about as well as these do, but what these do, these not only identify the risk for heart disease, they identify the risk for diabetes and cancers and asthma and all kinds of other diseases, not just cardiovascular disease. But those are the risks. A big waist, that's over 40 for a man, 35 for a woman. Triglycerides over 150. Low HDL, that's the good kind, so low is bad. Under 40 for a man, under 50 for a woman. High blood sugar, that's over 100 milligrams per deciliter. And blood pressure of 130 of systolic or 85 diastolic. That answer it?
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a question. This is Nancy from Goddard. Actually, I have a question and a comment. I've been in technology for 35 years, and you made an outstanding, just astounding and outstanding direct correlation between technology and the increase in MTS. And I would suggest if you go back and study to the early 90s, et cetera, and you'll see the new technology coming into the video games, that proportionately parallels your increase in MTS. Just a comment.
I'm really glad to hear you say that. Several years ago, I gave a paper on determining how much exercise we need for, let me see if I can find it, for weight control. And this is in the late 90s, and I was so bold as to stand up and say that I think that Bill Gates and all these other guys that gave us computers owe us some money because they made us fat. Because when we got these personal computers in the early 90s, the world got fat. Take a look at the trends. When I went to work at the Johnson Space Center, I used to have to take all my data cards over to Building 37 to get them all punched up by some computer geeks because we didn't have access to computers. But by 1985, I had 7 personal computers in my office alone. And that's around the time that the obesity epidemic started. And so there's no doubt that we are slaves of that technology, both at work and at home. I mean, our kids play on the games, and we watch our TVs and play on our computers. And, so thanks for the comment.
That was my comment, and then I have a question.
Yes.
Does a high HDL number offset any of the risks or even help a smidgy-widgy with the other risks?
Well, now the high HDL, that's a good question. If you look at all the risk factors for cardiovascular disease, the high HDL will, like, for example, if it's over 60 for a woman or over 50 for a man, that's the definition of high, milligrams per deciliter. That if you have, say, high HDL, but you're also old, you can eliminate the old. You can eliminate one of those factors. That's true for heart disease.
Not to get, since I didn't give my last name, so an HDL of 82 could maybe help on whether it's one of the other ones.
Well, it certainly does help to protect against cardiovascular disease, but if you still have the other ones, there's still a chance that there's a risk. But there's no doubt that an 82 is unusual and it's very high.
Okay. And just mimicking the other folks, I thought this was absolutely outstanding, the presentation. It's the first one I've attended. So
oh, well, the other ones were good, too.
I bet they were, and I can download them, too,
Okay.
I see.
Thank you.
Okay, so I guess if there are no other questions for Dr. Weir or any other comments, we'll go ahead and call it a wrap. And once again, Dr. Weir, thanks. That was an excellent presentation.
Thank you.